Edith Langston was no stranger to being underestimated at 75 years old. She was accused of fraud and obstruction of justice, a simple target for those in power. But when the judge sneered and the prosecutor smirked, Edith's calm demeanor hid a storm of determination. She wasn't just some defenseless old woman. She was about to turn this courtroom upside down from the moment she stepped up the air in the Fulton County courthouse. Thickened the Judge Everett Monroe thought he had it all figured out. He barely glanced at her before dismissing her as someone with no clue about the law, but behind Edith's composed exterior was a sharp mind honed by years of listening to her late husband, a defense attorney, and studying the intricacies of trial law on her own. She had spent decades preparing for a moment like this, though never imagined it would come as the accused when the prosecutor confidently laid out his case, claiming she'd falsified documents and obstructed justice. Edith remained silent, watching with a growing sense of unease. But it wasn't fear. She knew the truth. She knew the cracks in their story, the gaps they had missed, and with a calm, measured voice, she made her move. By the time Edith was done, the case had unraveled. The supposed evidence turned out to be nothing more than misfiled documents and a careless mistake by the authorities. What had seemed like a slam-dunk case for the prosecution collapsed under Edith's quiet brilliance. The real shock wasn't that Edith won, it was how she made everyone, especially the judge, realize just how wrong they were to underestimate her. You won't believe what happens next. Edith Langston had lived her entire life in the shadows of other people's expectations. At 75, she had seen enough to know how the world viewed her, a fragile elderly woman with a few too many wrinkles, a slow shuffle, and a voice that seemed could barely carry across a room. So when she found herself standing in the defendant's seat at the Fulton County Courthouse, accused of fraud and obstruction of justice, Edith wasn't surprised by the way the courtroom reacted. The prosecutor barely looked at her. The judge raised an eyebrow, as though humorously dismissing her, and the gallery murmured in amusement to them. She was just another old woman caught up in a scandal she couldn't possibly understand. But Edith Langston had spent decades in the background learning the language of law while other women in her neighborhood traded recipes and gossiped over coffee. Edith had buried herself in case transcripts, court rulings, and legal books. She had been the wife of Franklin Langston, a defense attorney, for almost 40 years, and had spent countless evenings listening to his frustrations, victories, and losses. She had absorbed everything, and now, standing in the very courtroom where her late husband had once fought his battles, Edith wasn't nervous. She was prepared. From the moment Judge Everett Monroe leaned back in his chair and gave her that smirk, Edith felt an unsettling but familiar calm wash over her. This wasn't her first courtroom. She wasn't intimidated by the glossy wood desks, the sharp suits, or the smug attitudes. What unsettled her, however, was the way people assumed they knew her, the way they took one look at her weathered face, her slight hunch, and decided she was incapable of understanding, let alone defending herself. "Do you think you're some kind of legal expert?" Judge Monroe asked, his voice thick with condescension. He glanced down at her. Over the rim of his glasses, lips curled in a mocking smile. "This isn't a Sunday book club, ma'am." Edith didn't flinch. The chuckles from the gallery faded as she simply stood, her back straight, hands folded in front of her. Inside, her pulse quickened, but her exterior remained composed. This was it. This was her moment. She had spent years training for this, not to be a defendant, but to dismantle a case if it ever came to that, and it had. The prosecutor, Samuel Reed, stood next. He was young, confident, and at that moment entirely convinced of his victory. The courtroom seemed to lean in as he spoke, his voice dripping with the certainty of a man who had delivered this speech 100 times before. "For your honor," Reed began, flipping through his papers, "the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant deliberately falsified documents to commit fraud and obstructed justice." When confronted, the words stung, but Edith kept her face impassive. She had heard this kind of thing before. A prosecutor with a polished performance, convinced he held the upper hand, but she had spent too many years in legal conversations not to see the cracks in the story they were building. She knew what they had overlooked. She knew what they hadn't even bothered to verify. When Reed dropped the name of Officer Thomas Harrow, claiming he had personally seen Edith withholding key documents, Edith felt a shift inside her. That was their key witness, the one who would supposedly seal her fate. The lie they were about to tell was their first mistake, the first thread to pull. She waited, watching them. She didn't need to rush. The prosecutor continued detailing the supposed events with mechanical precision, but Edith was no longer listening to his words. She was calculating, anticipating the gaps in their case. When Reed finished, the judge turned to her lawyer, a young public defender who hadn't yet found his voice in the courtroom. Edith placed her hand gently on his arm, signaling him to stop speaking. "I'll represent myself," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the courtroom. A stunned silence followed. It wasn't The decision itself that shocked them, but the certainty in her voice, the audacity of it, a 75-year-old woman accused of serious crimes, dismissing her appointed lawyer, and choosing to take on the entire legal system herself. Reed smirked, clearly amused by the thought of her playing lawyer. This should be fun, he muttered under his breath. But no one was laughing anymore. Edith's heart raced, not out of fear, but with a deep, growing focus. Every part of her training kicked into gear. Her mind moved faster than ever before, replaying her husband's voice as it often had in their living room late at night. Never let them control the narrative, Edith. Always stay a step ahead. She took a step toward the jury box, drawing all eyes on her. The moment hung heavy with anticipation, like the calm before a storm. She let the silence stretch, filling the room with an uncomfortable tension. It was time to show them exactly who she was. Your Honor, Edith began, her tone measured, calm. Before I begin, I would like to confirm something with the prosecution. Reed raised an eyebrow, clearly irritated, but playing along. Go ahead. You said Officer Thomas Harrow personally saw me withholding documents, correct? Edith asked slowly. Reed nodded, though the smirk on his face wavered for just a second. That's correct. His testimony is in the report. Edith took another step forward, her eyes locking with his. And that testimony is written in his report, correct? She repeated, letting the words hang in the air. Yes, Reed said, his jaw tightening. Now, and Edith didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to the judge. Your Honor, I would like to move to dismiss Officer Harrow's testimony as evidence. The courtroom went still. The murmurs from the gallery faded into the background as the judge squinted at Edith. On what grounds? Her calmness only heightened the tension. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a sheet of paper, a single page with a meticulous handwritten note. Because Officer Harrow wasn't even assigned to this case at the time his report was filed, Edith stated flatly. In fact, his duty logs from that evening will show he wasn't even near the scene of the alleged incident. The prosecutor's face flushed a deep red. The gallery shifted, whispering to one another. Judge Monroe didn't react immediately, but Edith saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Reed's grip on his papers tightened. You're suggesting we verify the officer's duty logs? Reed scoffed, still trying to recover. Are you serious? Yes, Edith said simply. If Officer Harrow was where he claimed to be, the duty logs will confirm it, but if he wasn't, then his entire testimony falls apart. A long pause followed, the weight of Edith's words settling into every corner of the room. Even the judge seemed momentarily unsure. It was a small shift, but it was enough. Reed hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. I suppose we could verify the logs, he muttered, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The cracks in the case had already started to widen. Over the next hour, Edith calmly and systematically picked apart every piece of evidence the prosecution had presented. She questioned witnesses, discredited documents, and exposed the lies buried in the details. What they had thought was airtight slowly unraveled the fraud. They accused her of clerical error, the obstruction of justice, a simple miscommunication in paperwork, nothing more. By the time she finished, the courtroom was silent. Not a single person moved. Even the judge, a man who had built his reputation on unwavering authority, looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and respect. And then, as the final gavel came down, Judge Monroe spoke, his voice softer than before. Case dismissed. The words echoed through the room, but Edith stood still, allowing the weight of the moment to settle around her. She had won not just the case, but the respect she had been denied for years. The judge, still holding his gavel, looked at her with a new understanding. Mrs. Langston, he said quietly, his voice almost apologetic. Ever thought about law school? Edith gave a small amused smile, a hint of pride in her eyes. I'm already there, she said, her voice steady and sure. And with that, Edith Langston walked out of the courtroom, her chin lifted high, not as the frail, underestimated woman the world thought she was, but as a legal genius who had just proven that no one, no matter their age or appearance, should ever be underestimated. As Edith Langston stepped out of the courtroom, the weight of the victory didn't sink in immediately. She had won, no doubt about that, but more than the case, she had won her own redemption. For years, she had lived in the quiet shadows of other people's assumptions, never given the chance to show her true strength. Today, she had erased that doubt, not with a loud proclamation, but through steady confidence and an unwavering belief in her own knowledge. As she walked down the courthouse steps, Edith felt something shift within her. It wasn't the validation she expected, but something deeper, a quiet, unshakable sense of pride. She had done this on her own. She hadn't just proven them wrong, she had proven to herself that age, appearance, and circumstance would never define her. That was the lesson she had learned. Never let anyone underestimate you, especially when they think they know your story. It's not about proving others wrong, it's about proving to yourself that your worth is yours to define. As the crowd bustled around her, Edith lifted her chin slightly, a faint smile playing on her lips. She wasn't just walking away from a courtroom victory, she was stepping into a future where she was no longer invisible. If you found Edith's journey inspiring, don't forget to like And share this video. Help Shoaib Buzzer channel reach 10,000 subscribers so we can continue bringing you incredible stories like this one.